quick one. What are we going to do today? I'm going to give the summary of summaries. So I'm going to summarize the previous 6 lectures, and I'm going to answer some questions. Questions that were raised last year, and the questions that were raised this week. Some of them this morning. But this is where we started. Starting from my background as an economist, how to understand compensation and benefits. And compensation and benefits is essentially a sort of a specialization of what is the price of labor. And so all of that is in economics comprised in one number, one variable called the wage. And compensation and benefit is about decomposing this wage. And there are a number of questions that were raised during this course, and we will go over them briefly again. Important distinction, pay for input, pay for output. Discussed what was better or what was more appropriate for different situations. We tried to understand why different wages were there. That's typically because workers are different, and work is different. We discussed fissuring, the boundaries of the firm. So that's a relatively, it's not a new strategy, but it's recently described in an important book, that firms deliberately choose some work not to be part of their company anymore. So they don't pay wages, they pay contract fees to other companies that essentially do the work. That was the question this morning about Fear and Schmidt, other regarding preferences, risk aversion. So, in essence, that are deviations from this very stupid, simplistic notion of rational behavior. And last week we talked about international differences. This is what we did. And it's going to be very boring if I read this out loud, but it's just, if you have only 5 minutes to prepare for the exam, these are the 5 slides you want to look at. It shouldn't be enough. I'm warning you. So this is the introduction I just gave. This is how I started, and I elaborated a bit on that. Eventually we talked about economics, labor economics, in the second week. And all of these concepts are essentially labor economics, but with a clear relation to compensation and benefits. And we continue from there to this book by David Weil about fishery, about subcontracting, franchising. And the chapter you were given to read from this book is about the relation between compensation benefit and this fishery process. We talked about income inequality, not just as an outcome of the CMB process, but also as a potential feedback. So if wage dispersion within a firm spreads too far, this could also have an impact on how the pay system affects incentives. This is the horrendous formula. So when you make changes to your CMB practice, your CMB system, you could beforehand try to figure out what will be the effect. So introducing performance pay, will it have the desirable effects, and what is the tool to analyze that? And in analyzing that, you can subdivide at least 2 major effects of performance pay: incentive effects, sorting effects. So incentive effects are the effects on the existing staff, the people that are already there when you change the system. And the sorting effects are the effects on new people entering and some people leaving. And theoretically, there will be effects, and this Brockton formula can be used to sort of empirically check how large these effects are. I talked already about pay dispersion, and I talked about risk aversion. I think it's important to, again, I've read this 2 years in a row in exams. When there is risk aversion, does that mean that incentives are non-existent? No. It just means that these incentives are somewhat smaller than in the absence of risk aversion. So when risk aversion is present, performance pay could still provide bigger incentives than, say, normal salaries, but the effect is likely to be smaller in the presence of risk aversion, and more often than not, risk aversion is there. Loss aversion is a related topic. This is the bonus-malus distinction. If you frame the incentives as a reward for better performance, or as a punishment for worse performance, then in the second case you are likely to see larger effects. People dislike to be punished more than they like to be praised. So the stick is stronger than the carrot. We talked about fairness and altruism. That was the complicated chapter. I will come back to that later. Again, the assessment of the effect of all HR practices and changes in them, but here for this course, mainly related to changes in the pay system. And we talked about, and I think that is important to stress that again, not just for the exam, or not even in particular for the exam, but in general, that performance-related pay is not the only way to incentivize people. Performance-related pay is not the only, and most certainly not the best way to incentivize them. Yes, it does provide the strongest incentives, and I've told you, I think already in the first lecture, that it has a tendency to provide very strong incentives, but to do what is the question. So I come back to the tomato picking example. Pick huge quantities of green tomatoes, not what you want. Okay. Finally, differences in pay systems. There were 2 studies that we discussed. These studies try to trace back differences in pay systems and differences in CMB packages to cultural differences between countries, either within the same multinational firm or between different firms. And the outcomes of these studies were relatively straightforward. So culture plays a role, and this has to do with risk aversion and masculinity versus femininity and these Hofstadter dimensions we talked about last week. And how to deal with those was the second study. So how do you design a pay package if you shift your business abroad? Are you going to fully adapt to the rules and regulations of the new country? So are you going to follow the conformance pressure, or are you going to follow headquarters back home and try to export your existing CMB practice to the new country, or do you pick and choose somewhere in between? And the relatively straightforward outcome was that most managers try to sort of trying to find some middle ground there and be practical about it, which I think is good advice for anything, and also in this case. Okay? So that was it really. This was the whole course in 5 minutes.